A room, cut off from the outside, isolating those who enter it, leaving its occupant with no way to effectively communicate with other people, as they slowly become lost inside their own troubled mind. Well, that's enough about my social life. Let's talk about Silent Hill 4. It's been a while since I've made a video, but with Halloween not too far away, I thought I would take another look at a game I did try, but didn't get very far into, namely Silent Hill 4, The Room.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Obligatory Tommy Wiseau reference, done. In my Silent Hill Roundup video, I said the game had good ideas that were let down by a lackluster execution. But one comment said that I didn't play the game long enough to properly judge it, and perhaps they're right. So after playing through Silent Hill 4, has my opinion changed? Kind of, but not really. I have gained a lot of respect for the things this game does right, but at the same time, there are a lot of flaws that drag the experience down. In many ways, this game really is the inverse of Silent Hill 3. Silent Hill 3 has solid gameplay, but a mediocre story, while Silent Hill 4 has a solid story, but really mediocre gameplay. And in an interactive medium, the gameplay is the most important aspect. I have a lot of issues with the story in Silent Hill 3, but actually playing through it is very engaging and wonderfully atmospheric, so it still works. Playing through Silent Hill 4, on the other hand, often feels like a chore. There's actually a lot to talk about with this game, so I'm going to break this into different sections and go over the good and bad. The story is very unique, and quite different from the other Silent Hill games. You play as Henry Townsend. He's living in an apartment in Ashfield when one morning he wakes up to find the door chained shut from the inside, and all methods for escaping or communicating with the outside world have been cut off. A few days later, a hole appears in his bathroom wall, which leads to a series of strange, nightmarish otherworlds, and Henry must journey through them in the hopes of finding out what's going on and eventually escaping the room. The story is well paced and well told, and the main antagonist of the game, an undead serial killer called Walter Sullivan, is one of the most intriguing characters in the entire series. On the one hand, his backstory is very tragic, and it's easy to feel sorry for him. But on the other hand, he's completely deranged, and by the end of the game is responsible for the deaths of at least 19 people. More depending on which ending you get. So you have to stop him, as he has become a monster, but you do feel a bit of sympathy for the guy. As for why he's killing these people, it basically boils down to a mixture of the psychological baggage from his tragic past and the religious dogma that was shoved down his throat as a child. Incidentally, in my opinion, this is the first Silent Hill game to do the cult stuff right, as it was Silent Hill's cult that helped shape Walter into what he's become. And it's especially creepy when you find out exactly what the cult did to Walter when he was a child. A deranged killer committing a series of ritualistic murders in order to appease his god, now that's scary, especially since the basic idea isn't all that far-fetched. A cult trying to give birth to God, on the other hand, and failing miserably multiple times, not so scary, and kind of dumb. And I think that's what sets Silent Hill 4's story apart. Like all of the Silent Hill games, it does get very surreal, and at times very, very weird, but it never feels dumb, unlike Silent Hill 1 and 3. The overall story is really good, with excellent pacing, nice twists and turns, and one unnerving and yet tragic antagonist. The only real weak links in the story are the main characters, namely Henry and his neighbor Eileen, who plays a more important role in the second half of the game. The one thing I like about Henry is that unlike all of the previous Silent Hill protagonists, he has no connection with Silent Hill or the supernatural shenanigans at all. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is rather refreshing. But I can safely say that so far he is my least favorite of the Silent Hill protagonists. He doesn't talk much, which is fine, but when he does talk, he just sounds like a doofus, and his dialogue is often just awkward. As for Eileen, she seems kind of interesting at first when Henry, and by extension the player, can only get occasional glimpses of her through the peepholes in the room, but once Henry actually meets her, she's pretty bland, and there's not much to her. Another reason these two annoy me is related to their role in the gameplay, but I'll get into that in a bit. Overall, the narrative in Silent Hill 4 is really strong, and it alone may be enough for some people. For me, though, gameplay is also important. The environments and worlds of Silent Hill 4 are also pretty good, especially from an atmospheric and visual sense. The main area of the game, the titular room, is very well designed, as it's big enough for there to be plenty of stuff around for the player to interact with, but it's small enough to give you that sense of claustrophobia, of being trapped with no way out, and the few spots that allow you glimpses of the outside world only reinforces this feeling. When it comes to the nightmare worlds you explore throughout the game, though, they're more of a mixed bag. Some levels, such as the water prison, the building world, and the nightmare apartment, are visually amazing and creepy. Others though, such as the subway and the forest, are pretty bland, and not that interesting. It's not to say they don't have their moments, but overall they're just not all that intriguing or scary. And even the good Nightmare worlds are hampered by two reoccurring problems, namely lackluster level design and hit-or-miss puzzles. In the previous Silent Hill games, the levels were almost always crafted very well. To unlock the way forward, you would need to obtain a series of keys, either actual keys or items that function as keys, and you obtained these keys by solving puzzles or through deductive reasoning. And as you're making your way through the level, you also have to deal with the monsters that roam through the level, and make strategic decisions about when to fight back and when to flee. It was a gameplay loop that worked incredibly well for the horror atmosphere of Silent Hill, and Silent Hill 3 just about perfected the gameplay in this regard. So it's a little disappointing to find that in Silent Hill 4 the levels just aren't crafted with the same care. The placement of rooms and overall structure of the levels often feels very haphazard, almost random at times. Some of the puzzles are legitimately clever, my favorite being the ones in the water prison, and traveling back and forth between the room and the Nightmare worlds to solve puzzles is also well implemented. But the levels are tedious to navigate through, often being either way too linear or way too open, with some of the puzzle solutions being annoyingly obscure, and the way forward typically found not through clever deduction but through trial and error. Another big problem is that in the second half of the game you have to go through all of the same worlds again. Now, from a narrative perspective, I understand why the game did this, and to be fair, the game does sort of justify this by having certain areas that were inaccessible the first time around being important the second time. But the problem is that the game doesn't do enough to differentiate the two times you repeat the level. Aside from a few minor tweaks, it's pretty much the exact same level again, and while the story moves forward, the gameplay just feels like it's on repeat, as you're going through the same place again. And the final major issue with the locations actually has nothing to do with the locations themselves, but rather with Henry. More specifically, what Henry marks on the map, or rather, what he doesn't. In the previous Silent Hill games, the protagonists were always good about making useful notes on the map as you explored each level, taking note of locked doors, broken doors, pits or walls that obstructed your path, objects that might be important, and so on. Henry, though, doesn't do much of this at all. He doesn't make any distinction between a door that's locked and a door that's broken, and when it comes to important objects or obstacles, he often doesn't make a note of it at all. So his notes end up being infuriatingly vague. So while the environment and atmosphere of most of the levels ranges from okay to really good, the actual layout of the levels leaves a lot to be desired. The combat in Silent Hill has always been a little clunky, but that's kind of the point. You can defeat enemies and handle threats, but you're never allowed to feel too powerful. The combat did its job well, and in Silent Hill 2 and 3 the combat found the right balance of making you feel vulnerable while not being mechanically frustrating. In Silent Hill 4 though, it feels like the combat system from the previous games got drunk, fell down the stairs, and broke both its legs, because while it still makes you feel vulnerable, it ends up being far more mechanically frustrating than it needs to be. Unlike in Silent Hill 2 and 3, you can't always reliably hit enemies, and the melee weapons feel even more wonky than they did in the first game. There's some stupid auto-targeting thing the game does, which makes sense for the guns, but for the melee weapons it just makes it unnecessarily hard to hit your intended target. That alone would be bad enough, but the game also introduces several other questionable mechanics. Firstly, the introduction of breakable weapons. Now, breakable weapons can work, but here they really don't. The breakable weapons break really quickly, almost as bad as in Breath of the Wild, but you also have access to multiple weapons that don't break. So why would you ever use a breakable weapon in that case? But the biggest problem is the limited inventory system. Now I can see why they did this, as you store excess items in a trunk in the room, so having a limited inventory encourages you to choose your items carefully and go back to the room when necessary. But personally I would have had the limited inventory only apply to puzzle items and healing items, and let you carry as many weapons as you want. A lot of the weapons break, and bullets are hard enough to find as it is, so restricting how many you can carry just seems like an unnecessary annoyance. Another aspect of the combat in Silent Hill is the monsters you fight. I'm skipping over the ghosts for now, as I'll get more into them later, and just focus on the regular monsters. When it comes to the regular monsters, Silent Hill 4 is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you have some that are genuinely scary, but on the other hand, you have some monsters that are just annoying, like the buzzy moth things. And there are some monsters that can be both, like the dog monsters. They can be creepy at times, especially when it comes to how they drain blood from the bodies of other monsters, but they can also just end up being annoying because of the wonky combat mechanics. There's also some monsters that are scary in concept, but lose something in execution. The design of the wallmen is legitimately creepy, but oftentimes the hit detection is completely screwed up, and so they can hit you even if they didn't actually hit you, and so they end up being more annoying than scary. And of course there's the nurse monsters. Design-wise, they're really creepy, and somehow manage to look distinct from the nurse monsters of the first 3 games, but when you hit them, they burp. and I'm sorry, but that's just not scary. I get that this may have been scarier to the Japanese, since etiquette is a bigger deal over there I guess, but to Western players it just comes off as silly. Silent Hill 4 was trying to do something different from the other Silent Hill games, and that's fair enough, but there's a reason why the phrase, "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" exists. The combat in the other Silent Hill games was fine, and the changes Silent Hill 4 made just end up making the combat more annoying and frustrating than it needed to be. In addition to the regular enemies that roam the levels, you also have to deal with ghosts, specifically the ghosts of Walter Sullivan's victims. Now, from a narrative and thematic perspective, the ghosts are a great idea, especially when it comes to the ones you run into when going through the worlds a second time. The ghosts are immortal, and the only way to stop them for good is to pin them to the ground with a special type of sword. But there's only a limited number of these swords in the game, and so you have to choose which ghosts to pin down, and which ones you just have to try to avoid. An intriguing and slightly unnerving concept. Another great aspect of the ghosts is the hauntings. For the first half of the game, the room is a safe space where you can heal up and catch your breath between trips to the nightmare worlds. But in the second half, the room starts being subjected to hauntings, and it's genuinely creepy to realize that your safe space is no longer safe, and that now there's nowhere in the game that's truly safe. But the big issue with the ghosts is that they're too relentless. They can't die and they can only be stopped with the rare special swords, fair enough. But the problem is that they won't stop bugging you. You can beat them up and they'll fall to the ground, but then they immediately get back up. To explain why this is a problem, I'll just use this clip from an old Jim Sterling Halloween video going over common problems in horror games.
While we're on the subject of Slender, that game arguably helped to repopularize the idea of the Stalker, an unstoppable force that follows you and cannot be stopped, and goddamn does it make Slender fucking annoying to play, as it does almost every modern game that has a Stalker in it. Familiarity breeds contempt, so if you overuse the appearances of a Stalker, that's all that happens. You get sick and tired of it. It just comes off like less of a scary entity and more of a troll. When you're trying to solve a puzzle or find your way out of an area, the occasional appearance of an implacable foe can be terrifying. Done too much, it's just irritating as you're constantly interrupted and thrown off course. Games like Clock Tower and Resident Evil Nemesis, they didn't shove their stalkers down our damn throats, they were used with care. That's what makes them memorable. I want to be yelling, "Oh shit," as a doggedly determined monster makes an unexpected appearance, not be sighing, "Oh fuck off," as another Slenderman ripoff turns up for the billionth time to interrupt me like a goddamn jackass. I love the idea of being preyed upon in a terrifying game. It's what made Outlast such a fine experience, but too few games get why it works. They overuse the trope until their monster is as scary as a pantomime horse.
If there was a solid minute or two between you beating up the ghosts and them getting back up, that would be creepy, as you're constantly reminded that you're being hunted down, but there's enough of a reprieve between each time that it doesn't end up being annoying. But as it is, the ghosts that come after you in Silent Hill 4 are another good idea once again let down by lackluster execution, and ultimately they end up being more irritating than scary. You know I had positive things to say in every other section, but I can't really think of anything positive to say here. In the second half of the game, Henry has to escort Eileen through the levels, keeping her safe and protecting her from enemies and hazards. Now I understand that Eileen is important to the story, but the problem is that A, she's not that interesting of a character, and B, the escort mechanics are just bad. Resident Evil 4 showed how to do escort missions right, and how to avoid making them annoying. In RE4, you can tell how much damage Ashley has taken, she always follows closely behind you, you can give her basic commands like wait, follow me, or hide, and she will obey them without question, and she does pull her weight by helping you with puzzles, unlocking doors, and doing her best to stay out of the way when you're shooting enemies. Now Silent Hill 4 came out before Resident Evil 4, so it does get a little leeway for that, but not much, because everything that RE4 does right, Silent Hill 4 does wrong when it comes to the escort. It's incredibly vague how much damage Eileen has taken throughout the game, she doesn't always follow closely behind you, you can't tell her to do even basic things like, stay here while I kill these monsters, or, run you idiot, the ghost murderer is right behind you, move. And she doesn't pull her weight at all. Okay, you can give her weapons so she can defend herself, but she's not that reliable with them, and letting her attack the enemies just increases the chances of her getting hurt, which is what you're trying to avoid. Also, I get that she's injured, but why does she move so freaking slow? Her arm is broken, but as far as I can tell her legs aren't, so why doesn't she move when monsters are in hot pursuit? Escort quests aren't an inherently bad idea, but when they're done wrong, they're really obnoxious. And while the first half of the game could get a bit tedious at times, the second half is just a chore to get through. So, what does all this amount to? Is Silent Hill 4 an underrated gem or a clunky mess? Probably both. Having played through it, I can understand why so many people like it, and I can also understand why so many people don't like it. It has enough good stuff in it that deserves to be recognized and praised, but its flaws are undeniable, and do drag parts of the game down a lot. In the end, my verdict is the same as it was before. If you liked the first 3 Silent Hill games, this one is definitely worth your time, and if you go in with an open mind, I'm pretty sure you'll find something to like about it. But if you didn't like the first 3 Silent Hill games, it's very unlikely you'll like this game. Still, I can see why this game has quite the cult following, and there are parts of the room I really love. Overall, though, I can't say I'm a fan. My final score for Silent Hill 4 is a very generous 7 out of 10. Definitely my least favorite Silent Hill so far. Actually, I take that back. Origins is my least favorite so far. Anyways, have you played Silent Hill 4? Which is your favorite Silent Hill game? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. I'm planning on some more Halloween-themed videos in the near future, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Look at the babies! Look at the babies!